Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So this week I wanted to create an episode that is aimed at those who are supporting someone with an eating disorder, supporting someone going through eating disorder recovery. This has been so highly requested both from recoverers and their supporters. Because the truth is, eating disorders can be very, very confusing. So the aim with this episode is to help those of you who are supporting someone with an eating disorder, supporting someone in recovery, to understand eating disorders a little bit more, and also offer some practical advice on how to support. So as some of you may not be regular listeners, you may be, family, partner, friends of someone suffering with an eating disorder and may not suffer one yourself, and it might be your first time you listen to this podcast. Just quickly about me. My name is Amalie Lee and I am an eating disorder recovery coach, also with lived experience of an eating disorder. So I think it's safe to say that I am someone who have quite a lot of knowledge about the topic. Yet I would also say that everyone's experience is different. I don't know everything, this is just me trying my best to convey some ways that you can understand and support. I work not only with people with eating disorders, I also work very often with their family, So I do have experience working with people without eating disorders who are simply looking to support, looking to encourage, but don't know quite how to do that. So first of all, one thing I want to say is I deeply sympathize with how confusing eating disorders can be. I remember before my eating disorder, one of my friends developed an eating disorder, and I was so confused of my friend's behavior. And I'm not really proud to admit this, but I will have to admit it. I was a little bit annoyed at times because I didn't understand it. I was like, why are you acting this way? Why are you doing this? Why are you being so weird? That was very often something that was in my head. Why are you being so weird? I did not understand it. Of course, I tried my best to be supportive, but sometimes I just noticed it was a bit almost like I wanted to roll my eyes. Like, what is this behavior about? Why are you doing this? Why are you being so strange? That was a lot what was in my head. And then fast forward a few years later, I developed an eating disorder myself. And one of the things I remember when I developed my eating disorder was that I was thinking, oh my God, now I understand why my friend was acting so strange. So one thing I want you to understand with an eating disorder, it is not people intentionally trying to be difficult. I know that sometimes it can feel that way. I know that's for sure how I felt sometimes with my friend. It's like, you are just being difficult right now. But it's actually based in a deep, deep anxiety. So the way I try sometimes to explain it to when I work with parents or when I talk to, partners or health workers, anyone dealing with eating disorders who don't quite understand it because they haven't had the lived experience, I explain it that it is kind of like a phobia. It's an anxiety in a way. So try and think of something that you're very, very scared of, right? Maybe you're scared of dogs or spiders or heights or flying or being on a stage. I don't know. Think of something you're very scared of, right? Then imagine having to face that every single day, repeatedly several times during the day. That is kind of how an eating disorder is like, and that's kind of how recovery is like. So having an eating disorder, and especially recovering from an eating disorder, is kind of like if someone is terrified of spiders, being in a room full of spiders every single day, just constantly. That is how it's like. Because the thing is with eating disorders, right? What makes them tricky is you can't avoid the thing you're scared of, right? That's what leads to a lot of the problems you see with eating disorders, right? Is that avoidance behavior. And recovery means, stopping the avoidance and actually engaging in behaviors that feel very unsafe when they are the behaviors that's actually going to save you. So I want you to know this. For a person with an eating disorder, engaging in, I just call it recovery promoting behaviors. So rest, eating more or eating outside of certain food rules, potential weight restoration for those who need that. That is something that feels very, very wrong for the person with an eating disorder. It feels terrifying. It feels like walking up to a dog and pet it when you're scared of dogs. And I know that can seem so strange. Like, how can something so natural and normal, such as needing rest, needing food, be such a root of anxiety? And surprise, surprise, that is essentially what makes it an eating disorder. That's what makes it a mental disorder. It's not in alignment with reality. It's not something logical. And this is another thing I always say. An eating disorder does not run on logic. It runs on absolute delusion. If it ran on logic, it wouldn't really be a disorder, right? But for the person with an eating disorder, they often feel and think that it is completely logical to them, right? And very often what people with eating disorders do is that they constantly look for evidence as to rationalize their own behavior. And this is one thing that I want you to be a bit mindful of. So let me elaborate a bit how that is, right? So a person with an eating disorder, let's imagine someone who is excessively exercising, right? And you can see that this is not a normal, healthy relationship to exercise. It's compulsive, it's anxiety-driven, it's rigid. They will very often look for evidence as to why their behavior is normal and healthy and good. And an unfortunate way that they are sometimes doing this is by looking at you. So someone could be in recovery from eating disorder and really be in need of rest, but they will look at the fact that you go to the gym, even though you don't have an eating disorder, even though your gym visits aren't disordered, and they will use that as evidence as, okay, well, they are doing that, so I should do it as well. And I know how frustrating this can be, right? Because it's not like you should have to change your daily schedule and stop, for instance, doing movement or exercise if that's something you enjoy, just to protect the feelings of someone with an eating disorder who's trying to use that as kind of ammunition for their own behaviors. But one thing that I could recommend is be a bit mindful of how you talk about your own, for instance, relationship to movement, and how you talk about movement with someone with an eating disorder, and also how you talk about food and your relationship to your own body with someone with an eating disorder. So for example, it's not necessarily that you should quit going to the gym because you may trigger someone who's a compulsive exerciser, right? You know, that's maybe not realistic, and that could also be a bit of a avoidance behavior for the person with an eating disorder. You can't expect everyone else to just follow your instructions, right? That would be a bit unhealthy. But equally, what could be an idea here is maybe when you've been to the gym, you don't really need to tell the person with an eating disorder that, oh, I just was at the gym, it feels so good, you know. That can be a little bit like, you know, if someone is an alcoholic, you wouldn't walk up to them and say, "Oh, I was just at the bar. I feel so good. Had a good buzz. Alcohol. Oh, it was so nice." You know. And I know it can be a natural, kind of almost like a socially acceptable script that when you've been to the gym, you're like, "Oh, I feel so good. I was at the gym. I feel good about myself." But I would recommend you to skip that around the person with an eating disorder for the same reason that you wouldn't say you just feel so good because you were just at the bar when you're around someone, if you're around someone with a drinking problem, right? The same goes with your relationship to your own body. Your relationship to your body is yours, right? You are allowed to think and feel and do with your body whatever you want to. Of course, investigating your own, maybe you have picked up some unhealthy messaging from society, kind of investigating that can be very, very helpful for yourself more than anything, also for the person around you with an eating disorder as well as a nice side effect. But anyways, regardless of your relationship with your body, that is yours, you know? So I'm not necessarily here to tell you how to relate to your own body because that's your journey. But one thing I would like to tell you, which a lot of people without eating disorders don't understand, is that a person with an eating disorder will very often look a bit at how you relate to your own body and try and use that as ammunition to harming their own. So for example, imagine if you kind of fat shaming yourself a bit around someone with an eating disorder, right? You might be like, oh, you know, my thighs or my stomach, or comment some kind of comment, right? That may seem innocent to you because you may think, well, that's my body. And also it could be that you have a different body type than the person with an eating disorder. So you'd be like, well, doesn't apply to you, right? But what the person with an eating disorder will tend to pick up here is, oh, so you're saying a bigger body or a specific body or your body or having body fat whatsoever is a negative thing. And they will also think, oh, this just shows that focusing on bodies, focusing on how your body looks like is something of high importance. So I should continue doing that. So one of the best things you can do around someone with an eating disorder is don't body shame yourself. Very often people know that, oh, you shouldn't body shame the person with an eating disorder, but also don't body shame yourself because that sends out a certain messaging to the person with an eating disorder that body shaming is a normal thing to do and that certain bodies are bad bodies, right? So the best thing you can do is to mirror a relaxed relationship with food, body, and exercise, including your own body. I see this so often where people without eating disorders kind of talk down a bit about their own body around someone with an eating disorder, or I don't know, kind of be a bit self-deprecating about their own body around someone with an eating disorder. It's not really helping. Or saying something like, oh, well, you're skinny, so it doesn't apply to you. Or you're skinny, so you can eat that. I need to be a bit careful, right? Because the underlying messaging here very often would be something like, food is something to be careful around. Bodies are something that are better, thinner, right? And I know this can be like a little bit confusing the way I'm saying it, but just trust me, I talk to so many people with eating disorder, and this is one of the things that they say over and over. And very often they are very scared of telling you this. So a similar thing, now we talked about how this goes when it comes to bodies and how it comes to with movement, this also goes with food, right? So this is one thing that I hear very often. People will, for instance, say to someone with an eating disorder, again, very socially acceptable small talk more than anything, like, oh, I'm going to be a bit bad and have some desserts, right? And I know it can seem so innocent because it's just what people say, right? It's not that deep. Like, it's not that deep. But for a person with an eating disorder, even though they're in a situation where maybe they even may have the dessert on their meal plan, like they have to eat it, right? Still, they will try and use the fact that you spoke about having more food, having a dessert as being naughty or being, any kind of negative wording, and they will apply to themselves. So when they hear you shaming yourself for having a slice of cake, they will tend to shame themselves for it or think, well, I'm not going to have a slice of cake then, because turns out that is like a morally negative behavior. So the best thing you can do here as well is be neutral around food when you are with someone with an eating disorder, whether they're in recovery or not. Because even if someone is not in recovery, chances are they may be contemplating it or have to go that route eventually, because an eating disorder is not a sustainable option. You don't want to strengthen their fears. If you have a slice of cake, enjoy that slice of cake unbothered. I can promise you that they are sensing that you're having a slice of cake unbothered, and it's something that gives them relief. And even if they don't notice that, because this is sometimes people with eating disorder can be very selective with what they pick up, they might completely ignore that you were relaxed and had a slice of cake. But they will pick up if you have the opposite, if you mirror the opposite experience, right? If you have a slice of cake, shame yourself for it, they will pick up and they will remember it. I think so many conflicts and problems and triggers when it comes to the person with an eating disorder and the person trying to support them could have been avoided if the person themselves took a little bit of a look on how they talk about food, movement, exercise, about themselves, and focused on that, right? Because so often people get hung up in what should you say to the person with an eating disorder about their food, about their body, about their movement. But very often, you don't really need to talk that much about that, right? You don't really need to comment that much on their food, on their body, and how they move. Instead, focus on having and mirroring a healthy, neutral relationship with it yourself. I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm not saying you have to go on some kind of anti-diet journey to, unlearn all of the toxic diet culture behaviors, right? I mean, if you want to do that, that's awesome, and I would recommend it. But being mindful about language can sometimes be enough. And try and think, what are you really saying, right? So for you, when you're saying, oh, I feel very guilty because I'm going to skip the gym and have some cake instead, what you're really saying when you use the words such as guilt and being bad, being naughty, is that is a negative behavior, right? Very often the underlying implication is that weight gain is a negative behavior. Rest is a negative behavior. Certain foods have like morally, negative in a way. The same goes when people talk about being good because, oh, I had vegetables, This can seem like a positive thing because you're thinking, well, person with an eating disorder is scared of food, so I'm saying this is good for you, this is healthy. But this also can imply that there are certain good foods and bad foods, when actually the person with an eating disorder very often have very strict rules about what is legal food and what is not legal, and you don't want to strengthen this. So instead think all foods are good foods, all bodies are good bodies, and rest is great. Rest is necessary. There is nothing negative about resting. I'm not saying you have to do this, but you're listening to a podcast about ways to support someone with an eating disorder. And I can tell you this. When I work with clients, very often they will have like 1 or 2 or 3 people. It could be a family member, a friend, that they see almost like a safe person, because this is a person that does not mirror a negative relationship with food, body, or exercise around them. Very often, this is not necessarily a person that is like intentionally trying to be super body neutral or super, say the right things. This is usually someone who has unlearned diet culture themselves, or maybe never got engaged in it in the first place. So very often they will talk about, for instance, like a younger brother that just doesn't really care about food or body that much and is pretty chilled about it, right? This person very often has no idea that they are actually the safe person, right? Because they don't really think about these things that much. But for the person with an eating disorder, seeing this person who is eating unrestricted, is relaxed with movement, don't body shame themselves or others, can be such a relief. And don't you want to be that person for them? And even if you can't 100% be that person, don't you want to be at least a little bit more like that person? Even if you're not someone that they see as the safe person, don't you want to be at least safer? I remember I had a person in my life that was an addict, and they would say the same thing to me, that I was kind of a safe person for them to be around because I had such a relaxed relationship with alcohol. I have no trouble, quit drinking. I'm very fine going to a bar, not having anything to drink at all. Alcohol is something that I just don't have any kind of addictive behaviors around, or any kind of strong desire to engage in binge drinking, for example. And they described that as me being someone that was safe for them to be around, right? And I think this is an interesting parallel, because you see the same thing with people with eating disorders, where they will also have a safe person, right? And I understand that we don't want to encourage some kind of codependency here. And also when I talk to clients talk a lot about the whole thing of like not putting one person on a pedestal where you look at them as some kind of like idol, where you just copy their food because, they have such a healthy relationship to food and body and exercise. I'm just going to do whatever they do, because that is giving someone a lot of power over you, right? Because imagine if that person were to go on a diet. Imagine if that person went to go on a bit of a fitness kick, right? Imagine if that person's body were to change. And in the same way I mentioned that I was kind of a safe person for someone in my life who is an addict. Equally, imagine if I were to start going out and drinking a lot, right? What should that person do if they had put their entire recovery on that, right? That's what building recovery on a stronger foundation than just mirroring and looking at someone else's behavior is important. We don't want to encourage codependency, but I do think that having some thoughts about how you can be a safer person for someone with an eating disorder is still something quite nice. But if you do notice that this person seems almost a bit dependent on you, right? They will look at what you eat and they will only finish their plate if you do. If you start noticing those tendencies, I would say have that conversation with them and be a bit mindful of that as well. Because you want to support their recovery, but you don't want to be the foundation in which they build their recovery upon. Another thing that is so important to get across is that everyone with an eating disorder have a different way that they like to be supported. And I know it's a bit ironic I say that after describing a very specific way how to support people with eating disorder. The reason why is because pretty much everyone I talk to with an eating disorder, they do express that someone who has a relaxed relationship to food, body, and exercise is something that they find helpful and enjoy. I haven't really heard the opposite, right? So that's why I started with that. But maybe there is someone who is the opposite. I do not know. But I would say again, everyone with an eating disorder have different things that specifically help them. So do communicate with them and ask them as well. And I think a lot of problems arise because people are too scared of having honest and upfront conversations. The best way to support someone is asking them how they like to be supported. But at the same time, I'm realistic, and I know a lot of times when people try and have these conversations, they try and ask, how can I best support you? The person with an eating disorder will sometimes just kind of freeze and not really have a specific response, right? And that's also part why I'm making this podcast, because sometimes I see people with eating disorders, they kind of know what would be a good way to support them, but they don't feel comfortable telling you. And that is, of course, both people's responsibility in a way. It's the person with the eating disorder's responsibility to actually communicate to you how they best like to be supported. And if they find it hard to communicate that could also be something to communicate, like, hey, I actually feel quite awkward having this conversation. I feel a bit awkward telling you how to best support me. But maybe they can send you a podcast episode, for example, this one, send you some kind of article, send you, some kind of resources, right? It is a bit their responsibility as well to help you help them. And I would say your responsibility, or I don't know if you want to call it responsibility, would be to at least try initiate conversations if you can, or engage in conversations if they're initiated. And I want to say that for some people, they find it easier to have these conversations over text. Sometimes other people find it more helpful to have them in person, right? So that is also maybe something to think about. Some people find that in person is a lot easier because then you get to see the body language. It's a different dynamic, right? Whereas other people find it that actually written form and writing it through a text message, or even like a letter, whatever format, having it in written form can be easier to kind of get their point across, get their thoughts out. So don't necessarily police the type of communication, right? Because very often people are like, oh no, we have to have these conversations in person. Yeah, sometimes that is the best, especially if you find that texting just tone gets misread and it ends up in a bit of a chaotic way. But sometimes, some people actually find it easier to express over text, especially when it comes to these topics such as, hey, how can you best support me? Or what something upset them, right? So try and keep an open dialogue and open mind to how you guys communicate. A common problem that arises in these conversations is that the person with an eating disorder will communicate something that upset them or trigger them or hurt them, and they will communicate it, and then the person supporting the person with an eating disorder will feel almost like they're being attacked or pushed into a corner or accused of something. Feel like they're a bit of a bad person. Like, are you saying I'm a bad person, right? And for the person with an eating disorder, I think what is so important here for healthy communication is communicate when something hurts you and trigger you, but don't do it in a way that is accusatory, right? Don't assume bad intentions. So if someone triggered you by talking about their marathon training, then communicate to them, hey, so you are of course allowed to do whatever you want. If you enjoy running marathon, that's good. But for me personally, as I have an eating disorder, this is a bit of a sensitive topic for me, and it would really mean a lot to me if we can maybe say it as a rule that you don't talk about your movement around me. And I know that's quite vulnerable, and very often what people do instead is that they give some kind of snarky comments about the exercise or marathon. They can be like, oh, well, you're running again, huh? Which makes the other person feel attacked. And when the other person feels attacked, person supporting someone with an eating disorder feel attacked, what's happening is that they get defensive and then start defending why they're doing what they're doing. So then they're like, yeah, marathon running is good for you, And then the person with an eating disorder get more triggered. And then, this is very often how these conflicts happen, right? So if you are the person with an eating disorder listening to this, try and communicate it in a way that doesn't make them feel like they are doing something wrong. Just say that this is about you. This is about your needs. This is something that trigger you. This is kind of, I guess, your problem. And you assume that they want to support you in this problem. Therefore, you're letting them know for their sake. And if you're someone supporting someone with an eating disorder listening to this, please try your best not to get defensive. I know this can be difficult, especially if the person with an eating disorder is doing it in a snarky way where they're making some comment. Oh, well, I see you're running again. Oh, interesting. You're having a protein bar, not chocolate bar. How come? I know that can be so annoying, but try your best not to get defensive. And if it gets tense, maybe remind them that, it's not about them. So instead of trying to rationalize as to why you're running the marathon and trying to say the health benefits of marathon running and whatsoever, or saying, oh, I'm choosing the protein bar because it has less sugar, don't tell that to the person with an eating disorder, because that just strengthens their fears. Instead, you can just kind of step away from the conversation or just gently remind them that, this is me, this is my life, my business. It has nothing to do with how you eat and how you move, and try to kind of don't engage in this never-ending debate about it, right? Because then chances are you will feel an urge to defend yourself, and then the person with an eating disorder will take this as ammunition for their own eating disorder. I know how annoying and frustrating this can be. I 100% know, but this is just kind of how it is, right? And remember that the eating disorder make people nice, sweet, compassionate, completely rational people act really, really strange and at times really inappropriate. Just try and think how you would act in a situation where you were very anxious and scared. Imagine if you have a fear of heights and someone was really pushing you to stand on some kind of cliff. You would be you would be snappy. Because you would be anxious, right? You would not be your best self, right? And with eating disorder, I always joke with my clients, the Snicker ad, you're not you when you're hungry. That applies to eating disorder as well. People with eating disorders, they are not always themselves. They may think this is just their personality, but then very often they realize that eating disorder is making them snarky, it's making them rigid, it's making them difficult to be around, it's making them disinterested in things not related to food or exercise, etc., etc. But equally, I would say if you're someone supporting someone with an eating disorder, you are also allowed to have boundaries. I'm not saying that you should just allow yourself to be treated like shit. You are allowed to say, hey, I don't tolerate you talking to me that way. You are allowed to step back from conversations. You are allowed to disengage when the person with an eating disorder is trying to accuse you or trying to, twist something you said. You are allowed to set boundaries. Very often people supporting someone with an eating disorder, especially I see this in families, they can be very scared of setting boundaries because they feel so bad for the person with an eating disorder. They are scared of, in any way setting boundaries, saying no, because that person is sick and I should support them. But sometimes setting boundaries is not just the most compassionate option for yourself. It could also be the compassionate option for the person with an eating disorder, right? Setting a boundary that prevents, for example, extreme codependency, could not just benefit you, it could benefit the other person as well, right? Because you want to have a healthy dialogue that is not completely saturated by the disease, right? It will be affected by it. That's naturally, you can't just escape that when there is an eating disorder in the room. It is the elephant in the room that will it will be there, right? You can't just pretend it doesn't exist. But try also remember that this is a person, right? This is person outside the eating disorder as well. See their eating disorder, but also see them. Sometimes people make the mistake of going too far in either direction, where they either see someone only as an eating disorder, or they are like, I'm refusing to see your eating disorder, I just see you. But you need to also see the eating disorder as part of them as well, because realistically it is. And acknowledging that someone have an eating disorder doesn't mean that that is what the whole relationship is about. It is more just like being aware of it. For example, that, hey, maybe this is not the person that I should talk about my workout routine with, right? So I kind of have to recap that a bit. As I said, have conversations. And I know that I will say this, and a lot of people still won't have conversations because we as human beings, we kind of avoid difficult conversations. It's a bit awkward. But it's so much better to put yourself in that temporary awkwardness and discomfort of having that conversation rather than the ongoing discomfort of constantly stepping on each other's toes and creating conflict because there is something unaddressed. Very often people with eating disorder especially think that if they just don't say something, that will be better because they'll kind of keep the peace, right? Don't tell the person that something there that you're doing is triggering, because that will create tension, that will ruin the peace. But actually it just creates more chaos, because instead of that temporary discomfort of that conversation, it's just like an ongoing tension. It's ongoing tension. For example, you started training for a marathon, and you're telling the person with eating disorder, oh, I feel so good, I just went for a run. And that person with eating disorder struggles with compulsive movement, right? It didn't strike you that could be triggering. And I can imagine probably part of you would have wanted that person with an eating disorder to just say, hey, you know what? It's a little bit triggering for me when you talk about that. So you can do what you want, but I would really appreciate if you didn't talk about your marathon training with me. But the person with an eating disorder think that if they say that, they're going to create tension, they're going to create some kind of conflict, they're going to, rock the boat. So instead, what happens is that they shut their mouths, and then you notice that every time you've been training for the marathon, or you come home and you're like, whew, just had a run, you notice that the person with an eating disorder is tensed, they are snarky, they're annoyed, or they're quiet. You notice something is off, and you don't quite know why. And you notice the tension and resentment just builds up and builds up. And the problem that happens here is that sometimes it explodes. So maybe one day you came home from running for the marathon, and you just say, oof, I'm quite tired. And then the person with the eating disorder just snaps at you for seemingly no reason. And you're just like, holy, what was that about? What was that about? I just said I was tired from running. And then it's actually not about that one event. It is a build-up of tension that has not been addressed. And then it is the thing, I may have mentioned it, but knowing how much should I support someone with an eating disorder? Should I push them? Should I just completely not comment on anything and let them do their thing? And this is an area where it's so individual. I will have 2 clients who will be in a similar situation, but they will have completely different approaches on how the people around them should best support them. And this is where communication comes in. I know I'm just repeating communicate all the time here, but it is it's kind of essential. Some people with an eating disorder actually don't really mind the people around them pushing them a bit, being like, oh, hey, let's go out for pizza, and, pushing a bit like, come on, you can do it. Other people would find that incredibly, just not helpful in any way. They want to be the ones who are suggesting it. And this can be so difficult for the person with an eating disorder to communicate, especially if they kind of secretly want you to suggest some kind of challenge, maybe going out for pizza. They're going to feel really bad for asking you to suggest that, right? Their eating disorder is going to be like, oh no. How involved you are in their recovery is really kind of up to you guys. And it's also a bit up to the dynamic you have. So for instance, if someone is a minor, very often the parent will be quite involved in their recovery. And I understand there are different opinions on this. I personally think that it can be very essential as long as the minor also gets some kind of agency in their own recovery as well, right? But sometimes people will take more of a caretaking role. There are certain cases where that is just kind of necessary, or kind of just how it is, right? And of course, this does present a potential danger for some codependency or someone relying too much on someone else to make decisions. But overall, if you are someone supporting someone with an eating disorder, it could also be helpful maybe to even maybe attend a session with them, with their therapist or team or whatsoever, and kind of build a bit of a plan. Or maybe even, because sometimes even if the person with an eating disorder don't exactly know how to communicate how you can best support them, maybe that could be something to talk about with their therapist. Maybe if they give you consent, you could have a session talking with their treatment team about these things, right? I have this a lot the way I work with families, where I will talk with someone and they will express to me something, and I can see, oh, interesting, maybe for instance, your parent should have known that. That would be helpful for your parent to know. And then we agree that I actually tell the parent. I also work a bit untraditionally in terms of working, across, like I work with families, parents, partners. I work with people's teams. I understand that not everyone's team work that way. But regardless how involved you are, if you are involved at all, or if you're taking a complete step back, one of the things I would say time and time again that comes up is what I said in the beginning. Focus on mirroring a healthy, relaxed relationship with food, body, and exercise when you are around the person with an eating disorder. And be mindful of, them selectively picking up certain behaviors from you, right? So I call it selective mirroring. So selective mirroring is essentially the person with an eating disorder will tend to mirror the behaviors you're doing that best matches their eating disorder. So for example, you've started low carb diet, right? They will see that you are eating low carb and they will think, well, this is a great reason for me to also take away my carbohydrates in the diet, right? But they will not mirror the fact that you're increasing your fat intake in response to eating less carbs. They will selectively mirror that you cut carbs. Again, this is just an example. But they will not mirror the fact that you had like 5 eggs and a ton of bacon for breakfast and overall increased your fat intake. They will mirror the fact that you started running to train for a marathon. But they will not mirror the fact that when you have gone running, you are eating afterwards because you're so hungry and you burn so much energy running. So yeah, the mirroring is often selective, but sometimes in recovery there might be some general mirroring where they also will start mirroring some of your more healthy behaviors. I remember this in my own family, that I will start eventually in recovery, I would start looking a bit more at my family and the non-restrictive things they did and start copying it. And even if they refuse to mirror any of your healthy, normal, sane, relaxed behaviors, at least don't give them disorder things to mirror if you can. But another thing that I want to say is please don't become perfectionistic about this, right? So often people who are around someone with an eating disorder, they get so hung up in saying or doing the right thing to the point where they can't be present. They're constantly walking on eggshells, terrified of saying or doing something wrong. And here's the thing, you will mess up. Like, I'm literally working with people with eating disorder and have had an eating disorder myself. I've been in this whole area for years, and I'm still sure that there must have been times when I have a client in a session, I say something that they maybe took the wrong way. It's gonna happen. And it's better that you show up imperfectly rather than not showing up at all. The fact that you're listening to this podcast show that you are actually taking some steps to learn more, and that is great. Give yourself a big clap on the back. Is that what you say? Clap on the back? I think so. Give yourself some credit, I guess, for actually trying to learn more, trying to educate yourself, trying to be a better support. That in itself is noticed by the person with an eating disorder. So maybe you accidentally sometimes said something that could be taken the wrong way. Don't beat yourself up over it, right? There is a big difference between being a constantly triggering presence in someone's lives versus accidentally saying the wrong things now and then. The latter is literally part of being human. So even though having a bit of a think about how you talk about food, body, exercise, etc., around someone with an eating disorder is very, very helpful, don't get so in your head that you're not able to stay present. And also, it's okay to set boundaries if the person with an eating disorder starts kind of blaming you, right? For instance, maybe you said something accidentally triggering and they're really holding on resentment for it and using that as an excuse to justify their own behaviors. You're allowed to say, hey, you know what? That's not okay. I see this dynamic a lot with parents and children where the parent will say something or do something quote unquote wrong or something that the child wouldn't like, and then they will kind of blame the parent. Well, I'm not going to eat today because of that. And of course, this also ties into the very unique dynamic between parents and children. And I don't really work with young children, so I can't really go too much in depth about that. I work more with adults, but even with adults, even if someone is, well into adulthood, this dynamic very often comes up with parents. And it's interesting because an eating disorder can sometimes make people regress a bit to almost like a child version of themselves. And Someone can be like 40, but if they're visiting their parents, certain dynamics will come up. And this is pretty common. It's frustrating, but it's pretty common. But again, having conversations and setting clear boundaries and agreements, so important. If there is a specific thing that you notice maybe shouldn't be discussed, for example, again, like I mentioned, the example of your exercise routine, maybe you find that that's a specific thing that just maybe don't discuss it with the person with the eating disorder. Have conversations, what is helpful, what is not helpful. It could be that they don't really care about you discussing your exercise routine with them. Me personally, I didn't really exercise during my eating disorder. It's not big triggers. I probably wouldn't really care that much, you know. I had family members that were exercising when I was in recovery. Didn't really bother me too much, right? So everyone is different. But equally, the people around me had a very relaxed relationship with exercise. So I definitely mirror that. I think if I had someone around me that had a disordered relationship to it, that would bother me. Very common boundaries that people set with, especially with friends, but could also be family members. It's just people not discussing their diet and also not commenting on their food, their body, or their movement. And this can be a tricky one because there are situations where it will be almost strange not to comment on it. For example, if you are a parent and you're noticing your child is heavily restricting, it's like, well, I shouldn't comment on their food, so should I not be pointing that out, right? So there is a lot of nuance here. But what I mean is more, for example, if someone is in recovery and they are gaining weight, right? Please resist the urge to comment on it, even if it's done in a nice and compassionate way. People with eating disorders and recovery from eating disorders, in 9 out of 10 cases, they don't want to hear, you look healthy, you look better, you look great. I know this can be so confusing because it's like, wait, what? That's a compliment. And yeah, I know. But the thing is, a person with an eating disorder, even though they are desperately, maybe not everyone, but a lot of them are desperately fighting to gain weight, they can desperately fight for something, and that can be their worst nightmare at the same time. A lot of times people with eating disorders, they are terrified of hearing you look healthy because to them it means, oh, you look fat. Fat is to them a negative thing. It's a negative loaded word. They can want to gain weight and also not want it. They can fear gaining weight and also desire it. They can feel proud about recovery whilst also feeling deep shame about the weight gain. They can feel proud about the fact that they managed to challenge a fear food, but then also feel extreme guilt for breaking their eating disorder rule. Understand that the eating disorders are full of contradictions, constant contradictions. Recovery can be someone's biggest dream and worst nightmare at the same time. So just be aware of all of the contradictions of recovery. Eating disorder don't run on logic. It is very, very ambivalent. A lot of ambivalence in recovery. One day someone can be super motivated. The next day they just want to throw in the towel. And in terms of the you look healthy comment, so what is very often the intention behind this comment is to acknowledge someone's progress, right? Especially if it is someone you know is actively trying to gain weight. You kind of want to, acknowledge that. You've seen them fight. You want to acknowledge, hey, I see you fighting. I see you're getting closer towards your goal. But this is very often not how it feels like for the person with an eating disorder. Very often what they hear, instead of, hey, I acknowledge your progress, keep going, they hear, oh, stop here, you're fine now. So if someone tells someone with an eating disorder, oh, you look healthy, when they are still not quote unquote weight restored, they hear that they can stop the weight gain now. And very often with eating disorder, people with eating disorder often want to maintain the lowest possible quote unquote healthy weight, or what they think is the healthy weight. Very often that's very disordered. So if they have a specific goal weight and you tell them that you look healthy before they are at that goal weight, they would think, oh, that means that I don't have to go all the way to that goal weight. I can just stay here. And of course, I understand that sounds ridiculous, because it's like, I'm just acknowledging your progress. I'm just trying to get you to keep going, right? But they will very often twist this around. So the best thing to do is just do not comment on their body. Do not comment anything that can be taken as, oh, I see your body has changed a lot. I mean, there are people who don't mind these comments. There are people who actually don't. They think it's pretty. They think it's nice. They think it's fine to be told, oh, you look so good, But a lot of times, people with eating disorders don't like this comment. In the majority of cases, when I talk to people with eating disorders, they don't really enjoy this comment. And very often they desperately fear it. They're so scared of this comment because they're so scared of how they would handle it. Instead, if you want to acknowledge someone's progress, what you can say is focus in on non-physical compliments, right? So you can say, oh, I noticed you seem more present, right? This is a big thing. So when you're talking with someone in the depths of an eating disorder, they're there, but they're not really there, right? Very often they just aren't completely present, right? And then you notice recovery may make them act a bit more like themselves, right? that is something you can comment on. You're like, oh, I noticed you seem more present. Or you can say, oh, I'm really enjoying that we can be more flexible, right? These are non-physical compliments and that are really nice to hear. Because sometimes people with eating disorders really romanticize the eating disorder and look back and kind of think, oh, wow, things were so much better back then. And hearing a reminder that, hey, you're more present now. We are having a good time together. I enjoy being able to go grab ice cream with you. This can be a reminder for the person with an eating disorder to keep going on the path of recovery. And this is another thing, instead of saying something like, oh, yay, good job, you ate the ice cream, woohoo. Again, some people with eating disorder are fine with this, but for other people, they feel almost shame that it puts a lot of focus on the fact that they ate that ice cream, right? Instead, saying things such as, oh, it's nice being flexible with food around you, or going out to eat something with you. It's nice to, be able to do those things together, right? Focusing on the quality time of it is very, very nice. What can be very nice is to make some agreements together, especially if you're someone who's pretty close to someone with an eating disorder. Maybe make an agreement, for example, okay, this weekend we can go and grab some ice cream, right? And if they back out, don't be mad at them. It's not like you're going to yell and scream at them, but ask them how much pressure it's good for them that you add. For some people, it can be they want to do everything on their own terms. They don't want anyone to come and pressure. Other people find that a little bit like, okay, come on, we can do it. Please, I really want to see you. Some people find that can be helpful, right? Communicate with them and ask them, how can I best support you? And I know that can be an overwhelming question to answer. So sometimes maybe give them some time to answer that. Maybe say, hey, you know what? It would be really cool if you can maybe write a list of specific things that I can do to support you, right? Maybe, especially for those who like having it written, right? Instead of putting people so on the spot, you could say, could you have a bit of a think and see what are some ways that you enjoy being supported? And also, what are some things I should avoid doing that maybe I'm not aware of? Are there any things that I'm doing that could harm you that I'm not aware of? And please resist being defensive when you hear the response to this. They are not accusing you of being a bad person. They're just trying to teach you how to better support them. This episode is becoming very, very long, and I'm noticing that I could have kept going for another 40 minutes, but I'm not going to do that because it's just too much information at once. Maybe I'll make a part 2 or make another episode about this, or maybe an episode specifically targeting, for instance, parents or partners, etc., because this is very generalized advice. And again, just reminding you, generalized advice, everyone has different ways that they like to be supported. But this is something, again, my observations from working with people with eating disorder, what I see very often comes up. But the best way to know is to have open conversations, communicate, set boundaries. And I know these are almost like buzzwords at this point. Everyone throws out the words boundaries, communication, without necessarily knowing exactly what it means. People think communication just means to talk, but there is a difference between just talking, because people can talk without really communicating, right? Communication is essentially about delivering a message, right? And that message being comprehended. So communication with comprehension is important. And if you're unsure, ask for clarifications. And you're allowed to protect yourself in it all. You're allowed to set boundaries. Just because someone is sick doesn't mean that they have a right to step all over you or to talk badly to you. You're allowed to say, hey, I will not tolerate this. But equally, have a bit of compassion as well, that this is a person going through something very, very difficult. An eating disorder is intense. It is horrifying. It is scary. It takes over your brain, right? And it can really turn the nicest people into someone you can barely recognize. This is a person acting out of distress. The best you can do is to be there and hold their hand, support them, but don't carry them, right? This is an important thing. You are not necessarily their therapist, their doctor, their, whatsoever. You are there, know your role, know your place, ask and see how you can best support, but don't feel like their recovery is your responsibility. And of course, I understand there's nuance here if you are a parent doing some kind of family-based treatment, but again, this is more a general statement. Support someone, hold their hand, don't think you need to carry their whole recovery. And please don't forget to see the person behind the eating disorder as well. I hope this episode was helpful. I'm not going to do a listener question for this episode just because this episode is more targeted towards those supporting someone with an eating disorder rather than the people with eating disorder themselves. Although I understand that a lot of people with eating disorder will also listen to this episode, maybe having some ideas on how to communicate to the people around them, how to best support them, right? Because this is another thing. When you have an eating disorder, it can be difficult to know how to best be supported or communicate how to be best supported. So maybe if you're someone with an eating disorder, maybe this episode was helpful as well. But also it's getting so long that I don't even think I have time for a listener question right now. But yeah, have an amazing week, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. And yeah, for some of you, I'll see you next week, and for other, thank you for listening.